The European Union will try to set up a specialized court backed by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes by Russia in Ukraine. That was announced by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on Wednesday.
While continuing to support the International Criminal Court, we are proposing to set up a specialized court backed by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute Russia's crime of aggression. We are ready to start working with the international community to get the broadest international support possible for this specialized court.
Ukraine has been pushing for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian military and political leaders that it says are responsible for starting the war. However, Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary to Russia's President Vladimir Putin, told journalists Thursday that any such body would be, quote, rejected and condemned, close quote, by Moscow. He noted that Russian investigators were, quote, working hard and thoroughly every day, documenting all the crimes of the Kiev regime, closed quote. He said this data should be bundled together with files about crimes committed by Ukraine since 2014, when a violent coup took place in that country, and Kiev sent its military to the east, Donbass. Casualties from 2014 until early this year numbered about 14,000. Meanwhile, the Inter-American Human Rights Court declared the government of Nicaragua in contempt of court Tuesday for ignoring its rulings on alleged political prisoners. That court is an arm of the U.S.-dominated Organization of American States, from which Nicaragua has begun the process of withdrawal. Managua did not bother to send representatives to the court's last session on the case, November 9th. Daniel Kovalik is an attorney based in Pittsburgh. He specializes in international law and has acted as a legal monitor of elections in various other countries in Latin America and elsewhere. He's just returned from a one-month visit to Moscow, and we spoke with him via Skype Friday. Dan Kovalik, welcome. I'm glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Don.
So, I saw two cases that caught my attention over the past week, and I wanted to discuss them, I guess, but use them really as a jumping point to explain to people what the international law architecture is about, what the international judiciary, to the extent there really is one, is, where it comes from, how it works, who runs it, that kind of stuff. But these two very political cases, basically, that have in common an ideological bent. And so maybe you could explain what those things are in some general, in those two cases in general terms, and then more particularly what this whole system is about and how it works.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we see increasingly over the years has been an international law system in which the most powerful states, in particular the United States, have decided that they will try to apply international law against everyone else, but not against themselves, right? So while Bill Clinton negotiated the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and actually did it in order to weaken it as much as possible, in particular regarding the war, the ability to prosecute crimes of aggression, because, of course, the U.S. is aggressing against other states all the time. That the ICC, the Rome Statute, was never ratified by the U.S. And then while Clinton did sign it, it was never ratified by the Senate. And then Bush unsigned it, of course. And then the U.S. Congress and Bush signed into law the Invade the Hague Act, which is what it's colloquially called, which allows the U.S. to invade the Hague if the ICC decides to prosecute Americans. So right there you see this incredible hypocrisy about human rights and war crimes, etc. I mean, if you talk about Nicaragua, for example, Nicaragua won one of the most famous international law cases against the United States in 1986 before the International Court of Justice, which found that the U.S. violated numerous tenets of international law by supporting the Contras, by bombing various oil facilities of Nicaragua and mining the Nicaraguan harbors. And the U.S.'s response to that decision was, one, it never paid out any money to the Nicaraguan government as required by the court decision, and it didn't stop supporting the Contras, which was also required by the court decision. But moreover, the U.S. made it clear that it would not recognize the general jurisdiction anymore of the International Court of Justice, even though it's a party to the UN Charter, which creates the International Court of Justice, and it's a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice. It said that it would decide on a case-by-case basis when it would be subject to jurisdiction by the ICJ, and it may, what it's done subsequently is it uses the ICJ offensively, but it won't stand before it when it's a defendant.
The court works when I'm a plaintiff or a complainant, and it doesn't work when I'm the defendant. That's basically how they treat it.
That's exactly how they treat it, and they aggressively use these things against other countries, but make it clear it can't be used against them, which, of course, what that means is there's really no international law. You cannot have a legal system that doesn't apply to everyone, right? I mean, That's the basic tenet of a legal system. It applies to the rich and the poor and the powerful and the weak equally, right? No one's above the law. That is the basic foundation of law, and of course, the U.S. does not recognize the application of international law to itself. So then you have, the EU and the U.S. making noise about wanting to prosecute high-ranking Russian officials for war crimes in Ukraine, including certainly they would want to prosecute Vladimir Putin. And when you talk about wanting to prosecute a sitting head of state for anything, what that is tantamount to calling for regime change, right? You can't do it unless the guy's in the dock, right? And therefore no longer in power, right? This is a call to overthrow the Russian government. And of course, the U.S. and Zelensky have been very clear that that's ultimately what they'd like to do anyway. So that's a very dangerous thing. And again, when the U.S. is unwilling to allow its own conduct to be reviewed by the International Criminal Court or the ICJ, but then calls on the same, bodies to prosecute Russians, well, I mean, it just doesn't fly. I mean, a legal system can't work that way. In fact, in addition to the things I've already said, you might remember under Trump, the International Criminal Court justices said they wanted to investigate the U.S. for war crimes in Afghanistan. And the response of Trump was to actually sanction some of the justices of the ICC and deny visas to International Criminal Court justices. Again, this is just absurd. And frankly, this talk is not, conducive to trying to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, right? And I think that, well, of course, the U.S. clearly doesn't want a resolution of that conflict. It wants it to go on and on in order to weaken Russia. Again, the U.S. is very clear about that, including through people like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who, by the way, was working at Raytheon before he became Secretary of Defense. And he's made it clear that the goal is to weaken Russia. So, and then when you come to Nicaragua, again, the hypocrisy there is amazing. I mean, again, the U.S. did not abide by the ICJ decision in the Nicaragua versus U.S. case. All Nicaragua is doing is, frankly, going after people who have tried to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny that the same liberals who are, all exercised about the January 6th so-called insurrection and want people prosecuted, including people like Trump, who weren't even there because they were the intellectual authors of that, have no sympathy for Nicaragua, who's going after the intellectual authors of the much worse violence, which went on for months in 2018 to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, and in which over 200 people were killed. And billions of dollars of destruction to property throughout the country was done, and to the economy. And that's who the Nicaraguan government is going after, the people who were behind that. And yet there's no empathy for Nicaragua trying to do that. And so that, again, it's claimed they have political prisoners, etc.
Take a look also at what happened in Kiev 2013, 2014. You had American government officials addressing a mob, basically, and inciting them to violence and overthrow of the government. And there's no provision whatsoever anywhere legally for getting some remedy for that. Now, one of them, McCain, is dead and beyond the reach of the law, apparently. But, you have Blumenthal and Victoria Nuland and a host of others that were there egging on this angry mob that camped out for months. And when they went home, bringing them back. And many people died in that. And this entire war now is a product of that.
Of course, and even Poroshenko, who came to power eventually after the coup, admitted it was an unconstitutional coup. He himself said that, right? Which the U.S. helped provoke, as you say. And yeah, if the West is truly interested in having war crimes tribunals, they should equally go after the Ukrainians and the Azov Battalion and all these people who've been committing atrocities for 9 years now, almost 9 years. And again, we see that all this is selective. A great case also is Rwanda, where there's a Rwandan war crimes tribunal set up. And while the mandate of it was to go after everyone involved in the genocide in 1994, they only went after Hutus. They didn't go after, frankly, probably the greatest purveyors of genocide, like Paul Kagame, who's been president now since 1994. And is a darling of the West, even though he committed genocidal acts in Rwanda and then went to the Congo and killed around 6 million people with U.S. help. The
U.S. has been conducting a war in Congo since 1960, really. There's millions and millions of dead people from that.
After murdering Patrice Lumumba. The president... by the way, I just saw Belgium finally returned his remains to Congo, which the sum total of which were, I think, a couple teeth. Because they incinerated his body. But again, none of those things are going to be tried.
Ever.
The law school I work at, University of Pittsburgh School of Law, where I teach, at the beginning of the year, they had a couple Facebook posts saying they're going to help prosecute Russians for war crimes, and they're bringing some Ukrainian lawyers over to help with that. And again, where were they prosecuting U.S. war crimes? In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, which are ongoing. It's a joke. I'm sorry. This is just virtue signaling by people like that. But by world leaders, it's more dangerous. As I said, it really is tantamount to a call for regime change in a similar way to where they were calling for Muammar Gaddafi to stand for war crimes trial. And of course, the West ended up sodomizing and murdering him
after bombing the country for 6 months
into oblivion. I think it was from March to October
20th. That's right. 7 months.
And and again, no one on the side of NATO in Libya has ever been prosecuted. The jihadists that the NATO partnered with, who committed atrocities and who actually committed genocidal acts against black Libyans living in Libya,
including
which
slavery.
was all spurred on, by the way, by claims by people like Hillary Clinton that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries to fight his own people. It turned out those mercenaries were merely either migrant workers working in Libya, or they were people who had emigrated there.
They were Libyans.
Many years ago.
They were
in fact, strangely, they said you could tell the black mercenaries by the yellow hard hats they were wearing. Yeah, we call those people construction workers.
That's right.
And those claims were all later debunked. But that really instigated genocide, because the jihadists then went after black people, depopulated whole towns, threw black people in jail, killed them. Again, no one like that are we going to prosecute, right? Instead, they tried to prosecute Saif Gaddafi, who was, at the time of the invasion, had been working with the International Democratic Institute to found a constitution in Libya, right? And he's the bad guy we're going to go after. So, honestly, I teach international human rights, right, at a law school. I've done that for 10 years. Mm-hmm. But honestly, as I tell my class pretty openly, I don't have much faith in what passes for international human rights doctrine. This is nothing but a means to go after states the U.S. doesn't like, right? If the U.S. doesn't like a country, wants regime change, we make claims of human rights violations against them, whether those violations are real, imagined, made up. All the Western human rights groups, especially like Human Rights Watch, jump up and say, oh, yeah, they're bad guys, they're doing this and that. And that's just a prelude to invasion.
That's right.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the U.S. has the most number of people imprisoned in the world as an absolute number and as a percentage of the population.
Right. Both, that's right.
Right. The U.S. has... is violating all the time the International Convention on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights by, having an economic system which creates, huge numbers of homelessness and hunger and lack of health care. As the UN reported, I think in 2018, they did a big study in the U.S. on poverty in the U.S. and other human rights issues. They said that, there's places in West Virginia and Alabama where people don't even have running water or sewage.
Yep, it's true.
And then you have places like Flint, Michigan, that have lead in the water. And apparently Flint is not alone in that.
Yeah.
So the U.S., and of course that's not even to mention all of the U.S.'s wars of aggression, which were totally illegal, which people should have been prosecuted for as war criminals. And you could say that about Obama. You could say that about every U.S. president, really, since World War II.
On that, by the way, there's something I want to point to. You've got the situation you described with the inciting of racist hatred and ultimately, murder by the U.S. government with the rumoring of African mercenaries in Libya and such. This is something that's right out of the U.S. history books. We look across the landscape in the United States. This was done against the indigenous people here and the Africans that were dragged here as free labor. And I'm looking at the institutional responses. Okay, so we know what the response to all of that, to the crimes in Rwanda, all these different places, what happens at The Hague, for example. I'm looking at the court case that was brought in May of 2011 by Kucinich and Conyers et al. Against Obama under the War Powers Act and the constitutional war powers provision. Said, okay, I don't remember, 60 days, 90 days, whatever the limit is, where the president has to report back and the Congress basically reviews either we're going to allow this war to continue or turning off the switch. And after bombing at that point for either 60 or 90 days, 11, 12 hours a day, every city in Libya, the Obama administration's response to this litigation, because the Congress wouldn't take the issue up, calling on the president to honor the law and stop the war and bring it to Congress, was that there are not hostilities going on right now because we are bombing the hell out of them, but they're not shooting back. So it's not hostility. That sat in the court, in the federal court in the United States from June until October 20th, and the only reason it went out was they said it was moot because they killed Gaddafi, even though they weren't there to kill Gaddafi.
Right.
That's how our local court system works, and this international structure, quote unquote, is not really a structure. There's really a child of the United States, and so.
No, it's amazing. And again, yeah, I mean, what you point out is, the War Powers Act is of course honored completely in the breach. We just don't declare wars. I mean, we're at war with Russia right now, but it's not a declared war.
Right. And it's not us.
Yeah, although in a way, for people like us, in a way that's good, because otherwise they'd probably be trying us for sedition if we were officially at war with Russia, because we're opposing it and whatnot.
That's where that designation is going, by the way. They're trying, they keep trying to get Blinken to designate Russia as a sponsor of state terrorism.
Right, and then we would be in trouble.
That's right, and Iran too, by the way. For I do press TV from time to time, and then exactly, we're in Lynn Stewart's jail cell, basically.
And the EU's already declared Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And so I just went to Russia. I just went to Donetsk, in fact. Mm-hmm. Which, you're basically even worse than going to, kind of mainland Russia. If you go to Donetsk, you're basically, considered a security risk. In fact, when I got back to the U.S., I had this global entry pass that you have to pay for and get an interview for that expedites your customs processing. Well, I found out when I got back to the U.S. from Russia and Donetsk that it had been revoked without notice. And I was pulled in by customs for interrogation. They knew I had already been in Donetsk, So the noose is definitely tightening, And as you say, if the U.S. designates Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, I think traveling there, I think doing any interviews for RT or whatnot, I think, as you say, they're going to just start throwing a bunch of us in jail.
Yep.
And that's a very scary thing.
Last thing, I'm just watching the clock. I'd like to mention, just as an example, maybe you could use it, the way that the situation in Syria is being treated. On the one hand, at the beginning of this in 2011, people here wanted to drag President Assad and members of the senior members of the government to The Hague, alleging all kinds of horrible things that it turned out were all trumped up and bogus. However, the U.S. has been conducting a war illegally and sanctions illegally against Syria now, along with Israel, Turkey, and others, since 2011, and there's no, and in fact is occupying illegally a portion of it and stealing oil. Yeah. I mean, they're like breaking into the house and stealing the TV set too, and yet there's no talk, there's no venue where that can be heard.
No, it's incredible. Yeah, as you say, amongst all the other things the U.S. has done in Syria, it is now occupying a third of Syrian territory, the most oil-rich part. It is stealing vast amounts of oil every day from that region, denying that to the Syrian people, who now have about 1 to 2 hours of electricity per day, even though they're an oil-rich country. They can't keep the lights on because the U.S. is occupying their oil land and stealing their oil. This is a war crime, the war crime of plunder, right? And yet, as you say, who is there to call for the U.S. to be investigated? Who is watching the watchmen, as we say? And the answer is no one.
Yeah. Where can I file the papers? There's no court clerk to take it to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dan, thank you so much for your time, and hope to speak with you again real soon.
Thank you, Don.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.